G'day folks, it's time to talk about something that's very close to my heart. Unlike my groundbreakingly trend-setting Friendworld video, I'm pretty sure that Game of Thrones is a very common topic here on YouTube. As I said, both the books and the show are very dear to me, so I was understandably a little upset by the finale where they assassinated 9 in every 10 characters with the efficiency of a little girl making pies. Look, I know I'm hopping on this trend of being angry about Game of Thrones about 2 years too late, but I'm sure I'm not the only person on Earth who continues to think that the wet cardboard that was Season 8 didn't quite live up to the 77-course feast that was Seasons 1 to 4. Before I really get into the meat of the video, the perceptive among you will probably have noticed that this is a completely different room to last videos. That's because I've moved house, which also sort of explains why this video took so damn long to get out. Another reason is that as of recording, I still don't have internet connected to this house, so not really sure how that's going to work, but I'll figure it out as we go. Now, I see a lot of people blaming the narrative shortcomings of Season 8 on the showrunners David and Dan. That's pretty fair. They seem to have the majority of the creative input, so yeah, it's their fault. But I also see a lot of people taking it to extremes. There are memes, YouTube videos, and entire online essays dedicated to preaching hate towards them and labeling them as terrible writers. Don't get me wrong, there were some major issues with plot, character, pacing, and world building that sort of arose in Season 5 and worsened to Season 8 that definitely came from them. But are they terrible writers? Google Images seems to think so. But let's look at the evidence. So the first thing I want to mention is book adaptations in general. Let's be honest, it's really hard to adapt a book, or God forbid, a series of books to the screen. It's easy to point to Lord of the Rings and say, well, Peter Jackson did it, why couldn't David and Dan? Well, first of all, it took nearly 50 years to get one of the most, if not the most successful book adaptation of all time, and A Dance with Dragons came out just 10 years ago. And by just 10 years ago, I mean, where's the next book, George? Where's the goddamn book? In any case, there were clearly several failed attempts at adapting Lord of the Rings to film before we got Peter Jackson's cinematic masterpiece. Most of them never even made it to the screen, and those that did aren't particularly memorable, although this one would have been interesting. Even Peter Jackson had trouble at first. He had to shop around to find someone willing to put enough time, money, and energy into the project. Which brings me to my next point. They're long films. The extended editions all clock in at over 3 hours each. In fact, Return of the King clocks in at over 4 hours. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is nearly 500,000 words long, so it is understandable to have such a long runtime to include all the necessary information. Now, if you've listened to the words that just came out of my mouth, you would have heard me say extended editions and necessary information. Both of these points are crucial in making a good book adaptation. Peter Jackson's films weren't a one-to-one of the books. They couldn't be. They'd all be 10 hours long, and most audiences simply can't go half a day without having a bathroom break, so they had to trim some of the fat. Every adaptation has to do this, not just Lord of the Rings. Ever heard of The Shining? One of Stephen King's best novels, one of Stanley Kubrick's most recognizable films. Stephen King hated the adaptation. He hated it so much that he tried to redo it himself with a miniseries, keeping every single detail that he possibly could. Now, I haven't seen that miniseries because I only hate myself so much, but apparently it was really bogged down by this intense level of detail and faithfulness to the source material, and could have benefited from trimming some of the fat. This shit is hard. Hey. What are you doing? That's not my cat, it's a long story. So in a video that I've claimed is about Benioff and Weiss and therefore Game of Thrones, why have I just spent so much time talking about The Lord of the Rings and The Shining? Well, there's a lot of comparisons to draw between them. I've just said that The Lord of the Rings is nearly 500,000 words long, yeah? A Song of Ice and Fire is over 3 times that length. More than 1.5 million words, hundreds of featured characters, and dozens of points of view to follow. They're really complex. Obviously they couldn't get made into movies like Lord of the Rings. George R.R. Martin himself, while writing it, thought that it would be impossible to adapt it to the screen at all, but Benioff and Weiss solved his little Jon Snow riddle over dinner, so he let them make it into a show. Their complexity and length meant that any faithful adaptation was going to have to span dozens, if not hundreds of hours, so every season of Game of Thrones was 10 almost 1 hour episodes long. But that's a really good start. So let's jump back to Season 1. Season 1 was undoubtedly the most faithful to the books. All the major plot points and characters are there and fleshed out, but it still did what all good adaptations do. It trimmed some fat. It moved around the timing of events to better fit the medium, it changed the dialogue and interactions of some particular characters, and it even added some really good stuff like that scene between Cersei and Bobby B, or shape-shifting Syrio Forel into Jack and Hagar. Or is he Meryn Trant? Anyway, my point is that even the most faithful season had to change things from page to screen. Now, I'm willing to bet that a lot of these changes came from Benioff and Weiss. Not only were they the showrunners, but they wrote 8 out of the first 10 episodes of the show. So I know we roast them pretty hard, but they're the ones who launched the show into success with a good adaptation of a great book. There's no denying that the writing they did for season 1 was exceptional. So what happened? Why do seasons 1 to 4 have this legendary legacy and the later ones just feel a bit shit? As the books went on, George added more and more characters, storylines, history, locations, you get the idea, more complexity. The show had to do the same thing, but there was just so damn much of it that again, they had to trim some of the fat and change some things around. This meant that over time, entire characters and plot lines were either changed drastically or abandoned entirely. Here's a brief list. Mance Rayder dies. Barristan Selmy dies. Stannis dies. Maybe. Jojen dies. Pip and Gren die. Beric lives. Good for him. But that means that Lady Stoneheart doesn't exist. Jane Westerling shapeshift into Talisa Valentis woman. Doran and Trystane Martell die. Arianne and Quentin Martell don't exist. Dawn becomes opposite land where little girls are killed on sight and one-handed men fight better than the baddest babes in the world. Roose Bolton dies. Ramsay Bolton dies. Jane Poole doesn't exist, so Sansa married a psychopath for some fucking reason. Littlefinger's character dies, then he dies. Meryn Trant becomes a pedophile, then dies. Arya's character growth dies. The Blackfish dies. Rickon Stark dies. I guess the North doesn't remember. Hisdar dies. The entirety of House Tyrell dies, and the rest don't exist. John Connington and young Griff don't exist. Dickon Tarly time travels to become Sam's older brother, then he dies. Euron Greyjoy was there. And Jaime's character dies twice before he goes to sleep under a blanket of rocks. Now, when I said a brief list, I meant it. These are just some of the big changes. Now, obviously, like with every adaptation, some of the changes are good. Like, I really enjoyed seeing more of Bronn or the Hound, and those scenes with Tywin and Arya in Season 2 were excellent. Some of them were neutral, like the shuffling around of characters or omission of some minor characters that didn't add too much to the plot, and some were decidedly negative, like quite a few of the ones that I've just listed.
The finger in the bum.
However, some of them aren't really anything yet, because we don't know what wider impact those changes will have on the story until it all unfolds. Which brings me to my next point. Lord of the Rings and The Shining were both complete by the time they were adapted to screen. That's usually how it goes because that's what makes sense. Now, we all know that's not what happened with Game of Thrones. A Dance with Dragons was released nearly a full year after the first season was filmed, and it's not even the last one in the series. There are 2 more books planned, and George reckons they're both going to be larger than that 400,000 word behemoth. So there's a lot of story left to tell, and I'm pretty sure that George didn't sit down and spend an entire week of his time just explaining every tiny little detail to David and Dan when they started the show, or even when they were close to ending it. George always intended to finish his books before Benioff and Weiss finished the show, and because that didn't happen, the show sort of overtook several story threads around season 5 and 6. Season 5 is widely regarded as where the show's writing started to decline in quality. They still had some major plot points to hit from A Dance with Dragons, but it was there that their plot changes really started to stack up. They changed Dawn, they changed Meereen, they changed Jon's leadership at the Wall, and they butchered the Manus. Now, some of these changes seemed minor enough, but what it really meant is that they were already deviating from the books for nearly every single character and setting. So effectively, they weren't really adapting books to screen anymore. What they were doing is continuing their own canon with the previous books as a reference and no future book in sight to draw from. Now apparently George did give Benioff and Weiss a few major twists and events that would definitely happen in the books, but I have to imagine that it wasn't that much information. George doesn't have a 50-page detailed outline of every single event that leads up to the finale of A Song of Ice and Fire. He's said many times that he's a gardener, not an architect. Even he probably doesn't know everything that's going to happen yet. So even if he had given David and Dan a bunch more information, there's no reason to suspect that it wouldn't be subject to change when it came time for him to actually write it. My point is that a lot of things started to happen in the show that either haven't happened in the books yet, or might not even happen in the books at all. Let's use Stannis as an example. In the show, he marches on Winterfell with a pitiful army and a terrible strategy that gets decimated by Ramsay Bolton and, more importantly, Sir 20 of House Goodmen. He then has this bizarre off-screen death that kinda makes you think that they weren't really sure if they wanted to actually kill him or not. Not really befitting of the one true king of Westeros. In the books, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Stannis will actually win the Battle of the Ice and take Winterfell back from the Boltons. Now, that could have no effect on the story whatsoever, but it could have a huge effect for Winterfell, Jon Snow, everyone in King's Landing, the White Walkers. We just don't know how Stannis will play into George's endgame. And what about young Griff / Aegon Targaryen / Fagon? He's just landed in Westeros with the Golden Company, and many fans think he's gonna wreck house and take the Iron Throne, winning over the people before Daenerys gets there, becoming the Mummer's Dragon from her visions in the House of the Undying. That would surely have huge implications for everyone in the series, but we don't know yet because the books aren't out and David and Dan cut him from the show. What I'm trying to say is that the decision to omit or kill certain characters earlier in the show has huge ripple effects down the line that make it impossible for them to follow George's story. It's not David and Dan's fault that he hasn't finished the books, so I can forgive some of the decisions they made because they don't know where those characters will lead to. However, their mistreatment of the remaining characters
A finger in the bum.
To be honest, I never really cared much for them.
You fucking idiot.
exponentially increasing use of contrivances just to justify outlandish plot points,
While Dany kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet and Euron's forces, they certainly haven't forgotten about her.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
and downright insulting internal inconsistencies.
So who's Lord of Storm's End now?
I don't know, Your Grace.
Does anyone?
What?
Is entirely their fault. Just because the series isn't finished doesn't mean there weren't very strong hints and clear character arcs to show where those set pieces will go in the future.
I'm going to put a prince in your belly.
Cutting out those characters and storylines was always going to alienate the hardcore book audience. That much is just true. It was always going to cause stirs among the community who were hungry to see these characters and haven't for nearly a decade. But it didn't have to be this bad. If they'd handled it well, it didn't have to be bad at all, just different. In fact, I've just spent ages saying that everyone has to change things to make good adaptations, right? And they found themselves in the uniquely unfortunate position of trying to adapt material that wasn't finished. But it was bad. It was really, really bad.
I'm going to put a finger in your bum.
One particular change was the worst thing. More than any one character,
Balls.
more than any one big dumb event,
Forgot.
it was the removal of the draw of the entire series. Consequence.
What they see is just the end of the Dothraki, essentially.
Once the show diverted from the books, nothing mattered anymore. Things just happened, not as a logical consequence of previous decisions, actions, or events, but just because the writers wanted those things to happen.
Forgot.
The result is not only a disappointing finale to what is, some of the most ambitious television of all time, but just a disappointing narrative in general. Like, obviously it's bad when you compare it to seasons 1 to 4, but it's also just bad on its own merit, which brings me to why I made this video in the first place. Brian Cogman. On April 15, Brian Cogman spoke out on Twitter against angry fans that were lashing out at both himself and David and Dan. He defended the showrunners, saying they weren't only responsible for the stuff everyone hated, they should be thanked for the things people loved. Not just their early writing, but also things like casting, production, editing, and you know what? He's right about that. I'm not here to diminish the great things that they've done with the show. The casting, effects, set design, audio design, acting, and just general scale remained incredible throughout the show's entire run, and there really were some truly shocking and beautiful moments that made for a unique viewing experience. That being said, I think the story issues of the later seasons do retroactively detract from those things. The long night cheapened the mysterious looming threat present from the very first scene. Character contrivances ruined or rushed series-long arcs, leaving them feeling empty. It's not the same going back to those earlier seasons and watching them knowing where it all ends up. It all becomes just so generic and rushed towards the end, and that is all because of the writing. So that brings us to the big question of this video. Are Benioff and Weiss really bad writers? Or were they just lazy and rushing to get to the end of their show so that they could get to Star Wars? The answer may shock you. It's both.
What?
Stuff can be two things.
Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive labels. So let's talk about how they rushed things because they were lazy first, shall we? What's the evidence? Game of Thrones is one of the most successful TV shows of all time, so it's not really surprising that HBO wanted more seasons, right? They offered them 10 full-length seasons. George thought that you could adapt the story in about 12 or 13. David and Dan couldn't even commit to 8. Now I know that actors, producers, writers, directors all get tired of projects eventually and they want to move on. But that's not the nature of this story. Think about all the unresolved plot threads at the end of season 6. Would you really try and resolve it in 13 episodes? That's barely more than a season's worth. All I'm saying is that if they really had planned to do 8 seasons from the start, then they wouldn't have spent so much time on unnecessary bullshit like Dawn. What we got was teleporting characters, a huge reduction in locations, and unearned resolutions that weren't fleshed out. Plotlines that would have normally taken entire seasons played out in single episodes. World building was forgotten because they couldn't be bothered to include everything anymore. Their explanations for the shitty plot got dumber and less coherent. Actors came to them to protest the killing of their characters or the outlandish treatment of these people that they'd embodied for nearly a decade, and they were met with derision and dismissal at every turn. David and Dan said that Ian McElhinney's plea for Barristan made them want to kill him more.
We got a long letter explaining why this was a bad idea, which just made us want to kill that person that much more, so, you know.
That's not bad writing. That's laziness, a lack of respect for the source material and your own cast, and arrogance that your vision alone is perfect. You know what is bad writing? Killing characters just for shock value. Subverting expectations just for the sake of subversion. It's even worse when they put characters in spots where they should be killed, but they're not because of their insanely thick plot armor. It ruins the realism of the show. Now I know talking about realism in a show about dragons and ice zombies may sound dumb, but I've been talking about the internal realism of the show that was set up since season 1 and now just gets thrown out the window. Let's talk about some more bad writing. Ridiculous cosmic coincidences shouldn't be necessary for your plot to progress. There are so many laughable contrivances in the later seasons that show that the writers really had no idea to get where they wanted to go in the story. They wrote whole sections of episodes and blew huge amounts of money from their budget on specific effects because we wanted a zombie polar bear. Just write the fucking story. What does this bear add other than another dumbass action scene where only extras die? There's too much. Let's do another speed round, shall we? Gratuitous fan service. comic relief that isn't funny, stilted expository dialogue, sidelining a main character to subvert expectations, introducing characters and players only to destroy them immediately, and omitting one of the most important characters for an entire season only to have him do absolutely nothing for a while and then become king because he has the best story. Look, we can leave it there. I'm not going to go through the entire show and point out every little way that they fucked up. If you want that, then go watch Glidus. He's a lot funnier than I am. My point is that you could explain some of this as them being good writers who just wrote something bad. I mean, it happens all the time, right? Good writers write bad things a lot, but not like this. This isn't one or even a few examples of incompetence or bad dialogue or weird story jank. It's a fundamental inability to piece together a cohesive and entertaining story. David and Dan are great at what they set out to do. They made an impossibly faithful adaptation of a series so grand and ridiculous in scale that the author only included some of the things because he thought it would never be adapted to screen. But in the end, they wrote something so panderingly, boringly awful that even the phenomenal production couldn't save it from being universally hated. So yeah, they're both. Maybe one day George R.R. Martin will release just 1 or 2 more sample chapters from The Winds of Winter so we can really see how bad the show's ending got fucked, but even that could be decades away. For now, I'm pretty sure we can all agree that when D&D had source material to draw from and look towards, they did a great job in transferring that to screen and adding to it in a meaningful and satisfying way. But then they didn't. They sort of got looser and looser until they had this feedback loop of clearly wanting the show to end quickly, so writing shitty scripts to shorten the show, and then being too lazy to hire actually competent writers to look over, edit, and then rewrite their nonsense. Anyway, this video has definitely gone on long enough, and I've probably repeated myself a bunch, so I just want to say like a huge, genuine thank you if you have made it all the way to the end and you're watching this. I really appreciate it, because I know it is a long one and it's a bit rambly. And as I said, I know that I'm really hopping on this trend really late, but it's fun to be angry, you know? And I love talking about Game of Thrones, so let me know if that is something that you guys are interested in, and have a good one.